Hello and welcome, everyone, friends of the European spirit. I thought I'd just go live for a bit and talk about German idealism. If any of you is interested, then this is for you. We begin, of course, with the old Kant and then move all the way to Hegel. If you have any questions, do leave a super chat, as they're called, and I'll get to your question at the end. I'll also just mention briefly that if you'd like to go deeper, let's say, into German idealism, then you should pick up one of the courses. For example, the German Idealism Masterclass. The links to those courses are in the description of this video. So this will take you from Kant to Fichte to Hölderlin, Schelling, and Hegel, and will also mention figures like Maimon, Solomon Maimon, Reinhold, and of course also look at what leads to German idealism to a certain extent. But the main focus, as I'll go over in a second, is the transcendental revolution that begins with Kant. I'll also mention a few books that you could read if you're interested in German idealism. If by any chance you want to focus solely on Hegel, then I'd recommend Stephen Holgate's The Opening of the Science of Logic. So these are 3 lectures by Professor Stephen Holgate on the opening of the science of logic, but also more than just the openings and not just being, nothing, becoming, which is also what my course focuses on in Hegel. But will also Stephen also addresses the good and the bad, infinite, in this one. And however, if you'd like to, this is a bit of an advanced course. Kant's Critical Philosophy, which is by me, introduces his Transcendental Revolution. So we focus mostly here on the first critique, 6 lectures on the first critique, and 1 on the second, and a final lecture on the third critique, where Kant does move us back out into nature. So what I'm going to do now, after this brief introduction, and I mention the courses again at the end, what I'd like to do is simply speak about what German idealism is, perhaps broadly speaking, and it doesn't matter to me so much when exactly it begins and etc. Kant is, if you want to be very technical about these things or scholarly, perhaps, Kant is not necessarily speaking a German idealist. That would begin with Schelling and Hegel. That's usually, I think, how it's classified, but that doesn't really matter. What matters, perhaps, what's it's not so much about the ism. The ism I don't really care about. What matters is why this is such an earth-shattering movement in thought, and the rather sorry attempts, be they by the so-called new realists, which was a bit of a fashion in academia a few years ago, has all but fizzled out. And more recently, though, of course, those who were part of the new realist fad, they're now they've all become Catholic, and they're now turning to Thomas Aquinas to try and circumvent Kant, which you can't do. Why? What does Kant achieve? Kant is, as Mendelssohn said, and it seems that he was quite worried about that, which is always good, der Alles-Zermalmer, the all-devourer. And he does devour and destroy all of traditional means really just Catholic church ontology, dogmatic metaphysics, if you like. That's what, and of course also Leibnizian, Wolffian metaphysics and ontology. It can't shows the impossibility of and revolutionizes thinking. How does he do so? The first critique is not on epistemology. The question is not how do I know what I know, etc. How do we know what we know? How can we, how is this a justified true belief, which is not the point, anyways, in epistemology. And it's not about forming knowledge so much as it is about revolutionizing thinking itself. Kant raises logic to the level of experience and ties experience to logic, transcendentally so. The transcendental means very specifically necessary condition for experience. That is what Kant achieves. And now, perhaps before we go any deeper, I'll just mention a few books that you could read if you were interested in just, bit of self. Obviously, what you should do is read Immanuel Kant's First Critique, at least in parts. So read the introductions and the prefaces, the introductions by Kant, I mean, of course. And I highly recommend. So I can only recommend what I've read myself. There's so many other books, but I could just recommend what I've read myself. I'd recommend in English. Sorry if that doesn't work. German Idealism by Beiser, published by Harvard. I'd of course also recommend, which I think there is. I think there should be an English translation of this book. Richard Kroner. I'm sorry. Oh, come on. Richard Kroner von Kant bis Hegel. From Kant to Hegel. So that might be available in English, I think. And of course, I also recommend it when it just comes to Hegel, but this will be actually more than just an introduction to Hegel. This will also introduce you to the other thinkers of the time. Kant, most prominently perhaps. Stephen Holgate's An Introduction to Hegel. Very thorough introductory text that introduces you to most all of what Hegel had to say. The course that I mentioned before focuses on basically the movement of thought itself. So it focuses on logic, if you like. So it looks at the first critique. I'll just mention this again, if you'd like to. If anyone wants to take this course, it's linked in the description. It's also just here, just to mention this. So what I trace in it is the movement, the revolution in thought, which again, the Copernican revolution by Kant is such that he makes objects adhere to the categories. And it is such a radical turn, or really revolution, because it's not the qualities of things, but it is anything a priori, before experience, the pure forms of intuition, time and space, together with the categories, constitute objectivity, against which the appearances are formed into an object in representation, to put it simply, or not so simply. And we find in his own preface at B1617 the following critical remark. So I'm going to translate from the German. I apologize if it's a bit not too if it sounds a bit too Germanic, perhaps. I don't know in terms of the grammar now, but anyway. So he prefaces this by saying that the first thoughts of Copernicus were, I'm just summarizing now, that if we want to explain the movements of the heavenly bodies, that wouldn't work so well if one assumed that the stars are ganz schnell nicht den ob es nicht besser gelingen möchte, wenn den Zuschauer sich drehen. So it is the turn is that the stars now have to adhere to the one who's observing the stars. I'm sorry. And then Kant says the following: in metaphysics, one can now, when it comes to Anschauung, intuition, or looking at objects, try something similar. If or when, no, if intuition uh, 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 has to direct itself by the qualities of the objects, if that's what they're determined by, then I can't see how a priori, we could know anything of it. However, if the object, as an object of the senses, is actually orientated or directed by how our capacity for intuition, then I can very well, he says, imagine something like this. So that's to say, what now has to happen is that objects have to adhere, have to follow human intuition, the human mind, if you like. This is oversimplifying it. It's mind over matter, if you so desire. However, what I should perhaps point out is that Kant has a tendency to speak in the language of the dogma, the philosophy schoolmasters at the time. So he uses notions such as faculty and the capacity to intuit, the Anschauungsvermögen, or the faculty of intuition, depending on the English translation. And he speaks of the senses, etc. But really, I think what ultimately is at stake is something quite different, which is really logic is how experience can be structured a priori before experience in such a manner that experience now has to follow categories. So that, in fact, and this is a response to Hume, with whom empiricism, in a certain sense, you could say, ends, any sort of regularity is out the window. Again, a bit, oversimplifying it perhaps, but what we can see in Kant is the attempt. It's not sure, you shouldn't think of this in terms of everything centering just on the human mind. Instead, it's an a priori logic that, if you like, perhaps structures experience before it becomes even possible. In a in a certain sense, one could perhaps say there's no object without subject, no subject without object. So we don't look out into the world and see objects and try to describe them as objectively as we can. Instead, objectivity is, in a sense, a screen of subjectivity. Subjectivity is not psychological, it's not personal, it's logical. So subject and object, in some sense, always already meet. What things are or may be in themselves is not the question. The question is for appearances, which may or may not relate to things in themselves, which generate representations, and those representations are ultimately then formed into an object, or a certain, let's say, causal relationship, for example. So, and time and space are purely the forms of intuition in this regard. Also, I should mention perhaps again. So let me just perhaps then point out, just to briefly mention the course again. What I do in the course is I go over the what Kant is actually trying to do in the first critique, why it's such a revolutionary text, and also then continue to address the transcendental deduction, and the noumenon, or things in themselves. So you may have heard this distinction between noumenon and phenomenon. There are no noumena in Kant. So it would be a reification of this term, the noumenon or noumena, which for Kant is, as he says, a Grenzbegriff, a limit concept, which tells the understanding, don't go any further here. That we should keep in mind. So once we start speaking again of what is the thing in itself, what's just the thing in itself, that's not Kant's question at all. There's no thing in itself. There may or may not be things in themselves. It doesn't really matter that much. What matters is how the categories of subjectivity, how it can be justified that they actually apply to appearances. And that's what deduction means. So deduction in this case does not mean to deduce something from something else. It means justification. Very clearly, a term here of a legal term. It's a term of jurisprudence. It doesn't mean, so if someone assumes that this is about deducing the categories, that's blatantly not what the deduction is about. It's simply about, not simply, but it is about justifying how the categories apply to experience, to appearances, say, and how that structures or brings about experience. So I would perhaps recommend in the B edition, section 16. So this would be, just briefly mentioning this would be the first 2 lectures of this course. And here's someone who says, hello, well, hello you. Just wanted to let you know that your lectures on German idealism have been very informative and clarifying. Thank you so much for the effort you put in. Well, thank you very much indeed for taking the course and also taking the effort of going through it. I think what the course does is that it gives you, we'll leave that up for a while. Such a nice message. It gives you the opportunity to find ways into some of these most important texts, such as the first critique. Now, of course, a course on German idealism could also focus on ethics or on aesthetics. But I think the revolutionary aspect is, first of all, we need to understand what transcendental idealism is, transcendental logic, or else we can't really follow what happens after Kant. If we assume that it's just about how we know something, that simply isn't enough. One can, in some way, deduce an epistemology from the first critique, but that isn't the point. If it had been something as benign, harmless as an epistemology, then it wouldn't have been the earthquake that it was and still is to this day. The traditionalistic, which is to say, it's a pure ideology at this point. The traditionalistic, self-styled, neo-Aquinians, the neo-scholastics. Neo-realism has run its course, so I guess we have to be neo-scholastics now, because apparently no one has any other ideas at this point. So we have to go back to Aquinas and just pretend that Kant never happened. Kant destroyed ontological proofs of God. And we should take that very seriously. Because what also happens, perhaps if there's another book you might be interested in, is that with Kant, what is prepared is, can you read this? No, because it's all mirrored and everything, is the return of the gods. And Hölderlin, of course, is the one who picks up on it. And so does, even though he doesn't know, Nietzsche, and so does Heidegger. So after Kant, we have Reinhold and Salomon Maimon, who are briefly mentioned in the course, and of course Fichte. Now with Fichte, I think, just to summarize Fichte briefly, which doesn't do him justice, but maybe I should mention this. Fichte is one of those figures who's really soaking in the enthusiasm of the time. To him, it was an age of, as he says, where the Geistesfunken sprühen, the sparks of spirit are flying. And this because there was some sort of, if you think about it, some sort of liberation, emancipation from, let's not forget, the clutches of the church and this foreign religion. So self-determination, now of course totally misguided, totally corrupted, but self-determination is really about this this sort of retrieval of a non-Christian insight into what is. But with Fichte, and with Fichte, importantly, what really comes to the fore in Fichte is striving. The danger in Fichte that comes out fully a bit later in his writing is already present in Kant, which is that nature might be reduced to mere fiction. And that is something we have to trace, because with Fichte, one could say, Schelling writes a bit on transcendental idealism, but with Fichte, you could say that the project is brought to an end. And so the so-called objective idealism that follows by Schelling and Hegel is, and to some extent, of course, also Hölderlin, is the attempt to, perhaps in some way you could say, return to nature and give her due, to let objectivity, or perhaps as Schelling might put it, realism, speak for itself, and to return to it. So just to go over this briefly, in the course, what I do is I address Hölderlin's notion of judgment, of the Urteil, the original part, his poetical eye, which is also a response to Fichte, which is not so much a self-positing. Again, every time I don't like this translation, by the way, of ego. I think ego has really, really not very helpful connotations or associations other people have. It's people might think of it as Freudian, or but what's the subconscious, which was invented after. No, it's so the I, the self-positing I, is a logical I. You're not talking to someone. Is also not substantive. I think that's what Heidegger totally misunderstood about Kant, for example. Heidegger detects everywhere a crypto-Cartesianism, and that's not accurate either, because when Kant says the I think is a representation that has to accompany all intuitions, then that's to say that this is logically the moment in which the manifold of appearances is brought together, is synthesized, if you like. But in any event, the poetical eye by Hölderlin tries to establish an I that is not purely self-styled, perhaps, and is instead always already entrenched, embedded in the world, if you like. And I found, while working on this course, which will be a book at some point, what I found was that his poem Die Muße, leisure, addresses this. I'm not certain whether there is an English, there might be an English translation of the text, actually, of leisure. I'm not sure. Yeah. Yes, there is. So there is actually, yeah. So there's an English translation of it, and it's rather unusual that he refers to what's at stake in this poem as die Muße. Why would that be leisure? It's something to do with measure, perhaps more than leisure. A certain measure on the earth that is found when, in the tempest of existence and of being, the human being again and again tries to establish some sort of balance, or a brief balance, perhaps, because the spirit of unrest is also always present in the bosom of nature. So it is the task of the human being to build a polis, let's say, in which those different forces are balanced. And I would just say this perhaps about so-called modernity. There's endless talk about decline and the time of winter that we're in. Um, then I would say that uh, perhaps we are in a perhaps we are in a it's a time of winter. Who knows? I mean, but the instead, perhaps what modernity is intensification. It's intensification of number, but not only. It's not just you cannot have quantity without quality. And this intensification is, I think, already present in the authors discussed here. And we, I sometimes wonder whether writers like Spengler and others, and their readers, of course, are perhaps, just temperamentally incapable of thinking just in a rudimentary sense, in dialectically. You can't have, this is perhaps too obvious. You can't have nature without earthquakes. You, there, if there is rest, there must be unrest. If there is decline, there must be a rising up. There's no katabasis without anabasis. This is so. I wonder if you know, what was this old fisherman's friend's advertisement? It doesn't it say something like if they are too strong, if it's too strong, you're too weak. So maybe all this whining about modernity is simply just being too weak about its intensity. Uh, and but that's just as an aside. And Hölderlin, what I want to say, does not fetishize nature. Does not think of nature as something holy or purely good. There is the spirit of unrest in her bosom too, and she will take as much as she might give. Nature, that is, which of course should be female. And for obvious reasons, if you think about giving and taking. And at the same time. And so from Hölderlin, we must move on to Schelling. I'll just mention this briefly, what we do in the course as well. I address the so-called oldest system program of German idealism, which I personally don't think is genuine, which is my personal opinion. I think it's a forgery. It doesn't sound like basically any of them. That means Hölderlin, Hegel, and Schelling. I think there's a bit about poetry that might make sense, but all this talk about creation must be out of nothing or else it's not creation. That sounds to me a bit foreign, to be honest. And so, but that doesn't matter. I address it briefly. With Schelling, what I address in the lecture, though, which is more important, is how he understands learning. And this is perhaps something you've never heard of. He gave a lecture course on university studies, which you should be able to find a PDF of, or at least a hard copy. And the the idea is here that the university is structured around a rather simple principle, which is that learning should have one goal and one goal only, which is to create. Learn only in order to create. That is, if you like, the fundamental principle on top, around which, or for which, and through which the university should organize itself. Or else it wouldn't be a university. What the university is supposed to do is to help those individuals who are capable of it to form them, which is not everyone, which is to help them form themselves to such a degree that they will be capable of organizing and creating, if you like, the future through a profound understanding of history, philosophy, and the sciences, which is to do with being able to understand and think conceptually, which, as far as I can tell, given how many years I've now taught, many people are not capable of, which is perfectly fine, but then you shouldn't be at university or anywhere near philosophy for that matter, or anywhere near anything that's to do with abstract concepts. Once any political debate or anything lapses into pro and contra, are you pro this? Are you pro this? Then you are already dealing with, and there's never any substantiality. So we do want to be able to get to actuality, what actually is, and be able to articulate it. And in Schelling, I always found his Freiheitsessay the most important one, simply because I think that this is where he comes into his own as a thinker, and it perfectly summarizes or brings to the fore, let's say, his thought, that is his thought, and he addresses evil. By the way, if you're interested, there's a video on my channel also on Schelling on evil. There should be something on learning it only in order to create, and there's a few others on Schelling's specifically. If you're interested, just without taking the course, so that should be on here as well. And so in the Freiheitsessay, I think in the lecture, what I focus on is what he means by real idealism, his criticism of Spinoza as dead and materialistic, which is what it is, lifeless. And from Schelling, we move on to no other than, of course, Hegel. With Hölderlin and Schelling, we've already moved back to nature, which is what Kant forgot, that she has her own right. And so maybe I should read this passage, though, from Schelling. Let me do this. Let me do the following. So I'll show you what the course looks like on the inside. Okay. Ready-made knowledge can only be memorized. Knowledge is not truly our own until we are capable of reproducing the given content in a form of our own making. Memorizing is but a negative condition. True and organic assimilation is possible without inner transformation of what we learn. It's impossible, sorry. All rules for study are summed up in this one. Learn only in order to create. Only by his divine capacity for production is man truly man. Without it, no more than a tolerably well-devised machine. He who has not, I mean, think of this in regards to AI, which is just machinic. There's no thought, there's no intelligence, and it's pure automated machinic spitting out of words. I mean, don't be stupid and think that there's any thinking going on. There's nothing in there. There's nothing divine in there, even though, of course, the makers of AI believe that they are in a pact which they have to fulfill almost biblical as it seems to them, to bring about AI, but that's not. It's not thinking. There's nothing in there. He who has not, with the same high impulse as the artist, who out of raw material calls forth the image of his soul, his own invention, who has not fashioned the image of his Wissenschaft in all its parts and features in perfect harmony with the archetype, has not truly grasped it. So I go over, this time here. This is just to show you what the lecture looks like, and then I address the essence of human freedom, which is um, perhaps, again, simply put, uh, human will to change course, the capacity to change course, and to be capable of good and evil at once. So here's Eman, who says, I might be too thick for metaphysics, but for good or ill, I'm fascinated by it. Well, that sounds humble enough, Maybe you are too thick. I don't know. But uh, maybe I am too, and I've just been better at fooling myself. Uh, but in a sense, though, so none of this has to do with IQ or anything. If you think of of Plato's cave, which has a pedagogic, that myth has pedagogic purpose and sense. What it's supposed to tell us is that we are all ultimately addressed by, as Kant himself says. How does Kant open this work? He says that this is the preface to the first edition. He says the following, and I'll return to Plato in a second. Human reason has the specific fate, Schicksal. He speaks of Schicksal. Yeah, this is something we can't escape. Schicksal is fate. You can't escape it. In einer Gattung ihrer Kenntnisse, in its channels of its cognitions or of its knowledge, that it is addressed by questions actually almost molested by questions which it can't push aside, but which it also cannot simply answer. And in a sense, we're always addressed by the question for what, justice, freedom, truth, etc. And we cannot just simply hope to answer or have those answers given to us. This is what AI is, just basically a faster version, sorry, of Wikipedia. So if I want to know what that is, type it into Google, boom, answer. Well, now you have an answer. Doesn't mean you've understood any of it. Now you can regurgitate it. That's the machinic memorization and regurgitation, which very often is what university, of course, has become, and demands of its students, and which is how so much of capitalist and communist modern society is run. But the issue is an old one. We are addressed by, for example, the question for justice, the kaiosune in Plato's Politeia. And in some sense, everyone sits in front of, let's say, a screen of shadows that we don't ask behind what those things, or rather perhaps those concepts, might be. And that is a painful process that requires anabasis, walking up, as much as walking back down. If you remember, there's no moment of sheer enlightenment outside the cave. The one who's been freed has to walk back down into the cave. And those who rule, or reign rather, by their mastery of the clay figures that produce the shadows, they are just as enslaved as those who just stare at. I mean, if you think about it, what would you rather be? Someone who's watching that puppet show, or the puppet master? There's no freedom on both sides. So, but in some sense, not perhaps to go too deep, but in some sense, we are always everyone I mean, how many intelligent people do you know, really smart people, who then just say, "Oh, democracy, our democracy, our democratic values, blah, 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 blah." Or people who claim of themselves that they are dialectical thinkers and they're really just in favor of one party. If you find yourself being a partisan in politics, especially in highly polarized times, then you can be sure about yourself that you are not thinking dialectically and that you are not capable of thinking critically in any manner. You're not questioning your basic assumptions, which are not even perhaps assumptions, but rather perhaps just preferences that wherever they come from. So, and someone asked here why Kant runs into the antinomies, by the way. Perhaps briefly, just to say this, and I go deep into this in the two courses. There's a course on Idealism, and there's a course on Kant, which is also linked to in the description of this video. So, what Kant runs into the antinomies, or he doesn't run into them, but the transcendental dialectic, I think, is critical because what Kant shows us is that reason is dialectical, and so he wants to tame reason. He wants to tame reason because it is inherently dialectical. Reason can, without experience, reason can argue for anything. The world has a beginning and an end. The world has no beginning and no end, to mention one of the antinomies. So that's what Kant shows us, hence he favors the understanding. And this is, once we get to Hegel, which I'm going to get to now, Hegel accepts that reason is dialectical and, in a sense, begins in the science of logic without any presupposition. So the principle of non-contradiction doesn't exist. What Kant does is he ties the principle of non-contradiction to experience. So from now on, if you want to be critical of capitalism, etc., objects have to be without contradiction. To translate this, they have to be without resistance. If you want to be a bit Baudrillardian, they have to be readily available for consumption, if you like. This is one of the consequences. Kant doesn't want that, but that's what comes of it. And so the science of logic, Hegel, that is, begins with being pure being. The first statement that thinking can make. As it thinks pure being. It doesn't think pure nothing. That would be nothing would be too much. So it doesn't begin ex nihilo. Very important. Very important. Instead, it begins with pure being. And so what I trace in this course is being, nothing, becoming, how they vanish, how being and nothing vanish into each other, bringing forth becoming. The vanishing of being into nothing, nothing into being is becoming. Of course, Stephen Holgate's course, if anyone who wants to go really deep into Hegel, it's Holgate. So there's no, I don't compare. But at least I think what the lecture will do is give you some notion of what Hegel is trying to do in the science of logic, and why the science of logic is his magnum opus and not the phenomenology of spirit, which is, in a way, something he has to get rid of. He has to get out of the way, in a sense, and has to get out of the way. Ordinary consciousness he has to address first until he gets to the heart of the matter. And we look at, of course, we do consider in the course briefly the absolute idea, and also the good and the bad infinite. Good chat here in the good conversation here in the chat. I sometimes find it rather a bit sad that there are those conversations that occur and then they just end during those live streams, and I've not yet found a way of how that could continue. What I would perhaps recommend you do is that, if that makes any sense to you, those of you who are just engaging in this here, you should perhaps just continue leaving comments then on the video, and then continue the discussion in this sense. And Yeah. So Hegel really completes German idealism, if you like, completes that old internet meme. He completes the system. Don't look any further than Hegel. And then, of course, Marx comes along. Right. Unfortunate. But, you can't choose your followers, can you? So, again, 3 courses. German idealism. I'll just show you those again. This is, I think, a really good introductory course for anyone interested in German idealism, more broadly speaking. And if I may quote a F from the beginning again, I just wanted to let you know that your lectures on German idealism have been very informative and clarifying. Thank you so much for the effort you put in. Well, thank you again so much. So here you have it. That's my Trust Pilot, five out of 5 stars. So this is the German idealism course, which is linked to in the description of this video. Do take it because it'll lead you on those along the path of German idealism, and you can then go further. You can go deeper into Hegel later on, which you could do if you so desired. For example, by this course, I just mentioned this briefly, by Stephen Holgate. That is Professor Stephen Holgate. You'll see the course curriculum here, so you see how long everything is. This is the minutes, so as you can see, it's quite substantial. And yeah, that's that. Oh, and of course, if you want to begin perhaps with Kant, I'd recommend, because there's so much talk about how Kant and accelerationism hang together, and the people I'm talking about, perhaps who go into this. I fear that many of those of you who, again, without thought, perhaps without thinking, just regurgitate things you hear about accelerationism, that perhaps you've never read Kant. Because what you may find is that when someone speaks of noumena as if they were things, this person may perhaps not know what he or she or whatever is talking about. So ground yourself, find a way back to actuality. Don't just regurgitate stuff you hear on the internet because it sounds edgy. And in the end, it's just an apology for the powers that be. So Kant's critical philosophy introduces the 3 critiques with the main focus on the first critique, and I'll just go over briefly the lectures. The first lecture is on the battlefield of metaphysics and Kant's Copernican revolution, which really addresses what transcendental logic, transcendental idealism is. Then, of course, we address time and space as the forms of intuition. The third lecture addresses transcendental logic and idealism more broadly speaking, phenomena and noumena, and the refutation of idealism. Then we go into the transcendental deduction of the categories, and of course, schematism, how it is that we perceive. The antinomies of reason, which I addressed a bit earlier, why Kant turns to the antinomies of reason, why he has to, because he does take reason seriously. And then in the end, is on the architecture and history of reason. Die Geschichte der Vernunft. The second critique, we look at practical reason and transcendental freedom, because this is something that the accelerationists always conveniently forget, is that the human being is absolutely free and can change the course of against natural law. Oh, that's the point of transcendental logic. That is the point of transcendental idealism, is that the human being can, if you like, speak poetically, move into the a priori and be completely free from anything, from time and space, any and all causality, and begin anew. Willpower, if you like. Freedom is at the heart of the matter of Kant, of Fichte, of Schelling to a certain extent, and of Hegel, of course, lest we forget. So those, merchants of accelerationism, and that's what they are merchants. They are selling you an ideology that is an apology, again, to the powers that be. So those merchants conveniently always leave out the most important dimension: human freedom. And of course, also the terror of the sublime when nature again shows herself. Instead, what we get, what they serve up, is some sort of philosophy 101 determinism. Everything has already happened. The future causes the past, which is not saying very much, is it? So, thank you very much for listening. And well, thank you. I don't know who you are because the AAAAF doesn't tell me very much, unfortunately. But I'm glad that the answer helped, and I would perhaps recommend, if I may, that the Kant course would clarify this even more, because in it I look at the different antinomies. We consider them, in not all of them, but the most important of them, and also why it is that Kant really has to turn to them. Because again, he takes reason seriously, but he also tames reason. And we also look at, if you interested, there's a couple more. There's so many videos, lectures on Kant on my channel. If you're interested, just type in Niederhauser Kant, then you'll find those lectures. So again, thank you very much for listening. Recommend this channel, this video, to anyone interested in German idealism, more broadly speaking, and anyone interested in Hegel, Kant, etc. And yeah, I hope that you can perhaps buy a course and help me keep the lights on. Thank you very